Well, balaíorí agus fearm fáilte I chealaigh roimh leog chuig coláiste fáraigh a nacht. Is mór an honorgum an talamh David Kertzer chur an úldaomh. You're all very welcome once again to St. Patrick's College, Maynooth this evening. It gives me great pleasure this evening to introduce to you Professor David Kertzer. This is the first time Professor Kertzer has delivered a lecture in Ireland, and he is most welcome in doing so, and it's a great honour to have him here to Maynooth. David Kertzer is Professor Emeritus of Social Science, Anthropology and Italian Studies at Brown University, and currently a Professor of International and Public Affairs at Brown's Watson Institute. The son of Lieutenant Morris Kertzer, a Jewish rabbi from Iowa who served as a U.S. Army chaplain in World War II, participating in the liberation of Rome, David Kertzer graduated from Brown University in 1969 and received his PhD in anthropology from Brandeis University in 1974. He taught at Bowdoin College until 1992 when he joined the faculty of Brown University as Professor of Anthropology and History. Sponsored by the US-Italy Fulbright Commission in 1978, he was senior lecturer at the University of Catania and in 2000 chair at the University of Bologna. In 2001, he was appointed Professor of Italian Studies at Brown, and in 2005 was elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. From 2006 to 2011, he served as provost at Brown. Among Professor Kertzer's earlier works are Comrades and Christians, Religion and Political Struggle in Communist Italy, published by Cambridge University Press in 1980, Ritual, Politics and Power, published by Yale University Press in 1988, Politics and Symbols, the Italian Communist Party and the Fall of Communism, published by Yale University Press in 1996. From the later 1990s, though, Professor Kertzer is best known for a host of studies aimed at wider readerships, beginning with the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, which was a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction in 1997. His The Popes Against the Jews, published in 2001, was subsequently described as one of the most critically acclaimed books of its genre and generation. In 2014, he published The Pope and Mussolini, The Secret History of Pius XI and the Rise of Fascism in Europe, which examined documentary evidence from the Vatican secret archives, renamed, of course, in 2019 by Pope Francis as the Vatican Apostolic Archive. And this book won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in April 2015. In 2018, Professor Kertzer returned to his lifelong fascination with 19th century history when he published The Pope Who Would Be King, The Exile of Pius IX and the Emergence of Modern Europe. He published that with Oxford University Press. On the 2nd of March 2020, that very fateful month, but before we knew what was going to happen to us in the weeks afterwards, on the 2nd of March 2020, claiming that the Church isn't afraid of history, Pope Francis opened the Vatican archives on World War II era Pope Pius XII. David Kertzer was one of the first people waiting outside on that first day. Having examined thousands of relevant documents from Italian, German, French, British, and American government archives, Professor Kertzer's The Pope at War was published by Random House in 2022. The Times Literary Supplement called it thoroughly researched and beautifully narrated. And Kevin Madigan, professor of ecclesiastical history at Harvard, called it the crowning of Kertzer's extraordinary career. But perhaps he has spoken too soon. Because more recently, Professor Kertzer has become fascinated by one aspect of what happened when Benito Mussolini created anti-Jewish laws in 1938. Thousands of Jews, in an attempt to escape persecution, rushed to get baptized and have their racial identity changed from Jewish to Aryan. In some cases, that decision literally saved their lives. And currently, Professor Kertzer is completing a book project for Random House on this topic, and the book will be released next year. On a personal level, I've hugely enjoyed reading the works of David Kertzer for many years now. And if I may say something about them that I hope is not misconstrued, I could get myself in trouble here, especially when there's a camera. They're the sort of book that you could very easily bring along with you to the beach. And that's certainly not something that you can say about every historical work. Others, though, have put it more elegantly. One reviewer speaks of Kertzer writing with the pace of Tolstoyan revelation. And the National Catholic Reporter calls his writing character-driven history, well-placed with textured personalities and a wealth of granular detail. Now, even for those who may disagree with Professor Kertzer's conclusions, they might admit, as Pope Pius X did when he read, rather critically, I might add, Alfred Loisy's L'Évangile et l'Église, the Gospel and the Church, in 1902, because reportedly, Pope Pius X said that here at least was a theological work that wasn't boring. Likewise, no one could ever accuse David Kertzer's histories of being dull. It's a rare and very welcome skill. David, it's a real pleasure to have you among us this evening, to be able to welcome you to Maynooth, to be able to welcome you to speak in Ireland for the first time, to be able to welcome you to St. Patrick's Pontifical University at Maynooth. And now I'd like to invite you to deliver this academic year's Corish lecture on Eugenio Pacelli and the Vatican's Irish plan to save baptized Jews, 1938 to 39. Thank you.
Thank you for that very generous introduction and for your hospitality, Professor Ryan, and for that of your colleagues. I've really enjoyed my time here, and I'm almost embarrassed by the fact that this is the first time I've spent any time outside of Dublin. Not that I've spent much time there either in my life, so getting to see a bit of Ireland has been a great treat. As was mentioned, the archives for the papacy of Pius XII were only opened recently in 2020. And this has led to a kind of boom in research on a variety of questions, including some very controversial issues over the last decades. Quite a lot was known about this history from other sources other than the Vatican, plus as a result of the controversy over the so-called silence of the Pope of Pius XII, his failure to denounce the Holocaust while it was taking place, Pope Paul VI had back between 65 and 81 commissioned a group of Jesuit historians to put together what turned out to be 12 physical volumes, thick volumes, containing thousands of documents from World War II from the archives that the rest of us weren't allowed in. So we already had quite a lot of background, but we scholars were eagerly awaiting, in fact demanding or begging for years to have these archives open. As was mentioned, Pope Francis finally authorized the opening. The timing turned out to be somewhat unfortunate, as maybe you have a picture there. Professor Ryan mentioned that first morning that we were waiting outside the gates of what was still, when was I guess the previous year the Pope had changed the name from Archivio Segreto Vaticano, the Vatican Secret Archive, to the Archivio Apostolico Italiano, the Vatican Archivio Apostolico Vaticano, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Unlike Professor Wolf and I guess the German system, American professors don't get to have a phalanx of assistants go with them when they do research, so we were all envious of this. There we were on March 2nd when they finally opened them. We didn't realize, of course, at the time that they would be closed a week later for several months, but due to this new virus that was making its way through Italy at the time. Well, what I'd like to do today, though, is focus on a topic that I kind of came across, you might say by chance, and that it was a little bit outside of my main focus. But I noticed that as I was looking at the question of the help given by the Vatican to Jews during the years of the war and the Holocaust, that Ireland kept appearing, at least in the early documents, quite a lot. And I was rather surprised by this. So I thought I'd take the opportunity provided by this invitation to speak with you today to look a little bit more in detail at why Ireland was cropping up so much and what role it was playing. Normally we, of course, take the Holocaust to beginning, and the war only beginning with the invasion of Poland in September 1940, and then the Holocaust beginning subsequently. But from an Italian point of view, the persecution of the Jews begins really in 1938 with the so-called racial laws. And these, here, the Pope at the time, Pope Pius XI, Pope from 1922 to February 1939. But the racial laws that came, well, take a step back. What happens is Italy, of course, is getting closer and closer to Nazi Germany from the time of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. In the spring of '38, Hitler pays a triumphal visit to Italy, goes around parading through the streets with Mussolini in Rome, Naples, Florence. In July, much to the shock of the Jews of Italy and many others there, the regime announces its new so-called racial policy, which states that there's a pure Italian Aryan race and then there's a foreign Jewish race. This would be followed in rather short order by early September of the first racial laws. And those racials, you see here, the second set, the first set in beginning of September did two things: threw all Jewish kids out of school and fired all Jewish teachers and professors at all levels of the educational system. It also called on all foreign Jews, that is non-Italian citizens who are Jewish, to leave the country within a matter of months. And because in previous months, many Jews from the Third Reich had actually fled into Italy, there was a fairly large number of those non-Italian Jewish immigrants in Italy who were now ordered out, and the only place they could be sure they could be sent to would be the Third Reich. It would be then in November that the second set of racial laws would come through, and here, as you see, this is from a publication begun in August of '38 as part of the racial campaign, La Difesa della Razza, the defense of the race, showing what some of those laws were doing, which was throwing Jews out of many sectors of the economy. They'd be sent out of many other sectors of the economy in succeeding months by other racial laws that would come in. Well, in 2022, as a result of the continuing controversy over the silence of the Pope during the Holocaust and the kind of defense of the, you might say, the main approved narrative of the Vatican being that the Pope didn't speak out because to do so would be harmful to the Jews, and he could work behind the scenes more effectively to protect Jews by not speaking out. Part of the ongoing, you might say, nervousness or defensiveness of the Vatican is reflected in the fact that in 2022, they put online the so-called Jews file, Serie Bre, from the Secretariat of State. There was this body of 2,700, roughly, folders of cases of Jews, so-called Jews, I'll get to that in a minute, who appealed to the Vatican for help in the years from 1938 principally to 1943. This is where part of the one of the main sources where I kept running into the Irish question, and one of my remarks today are based in part on the study of those 2,700 files, but also on the files. Those are in the Secretary of State archives, which are separate actually from the main Archivio Apostolico archives. In the main apostolic archives, you find the correspondence with the nuncio in Dublin, and this would be my other main source. So partly from the Vatican Secretary of State archives, partly from the Archivio Apostolico Vaticano archives. Putting those together is the main material that I'll be talking about today. Now, the Jews file, let's see, here is the man, the principal behind my remarks today, because before he becomes Pope, of course, in March of 1939, Eugenio Pacelli is the long-serving Secretary of State of the Vatican from 1930. So he's basically Pius XI's right-hand man in these years, and he's the one who is dealing with these pleas from Jews, and as we'll see, from converted Jews, for help. Most of these in the early years, so basically while he's still Secretary of State before he becomes Pope, are actually coming from Italy. Later on, many would come from other parts of Europe, but the imposition of the racial laws has led to a rush of people who are affected by the racial laws to ask for help from the Vatican. And part of the reason for this is, of course, in fascist Italy, the only kind of alternative source of power and authority in Italy, and an important one, was the Vatican and the Church itself, which, of course, continued to have great influence in a country that was practically 99% Roman Catholic. Mussolini had gotten rid of all other alternative sources of authority and organization in the country over the previous 2 decades. Well, in particular, what you have more than anything in those early months, a lot of the pleas were coming from those Jews who were not Italian citizens, who were being kicked out and facing going back to the Third Reich. This is now right after the Kristallnacht, for example. So the prospect of being thrown out of Italy and thrown back into the Third Reich was certainly terrifying. Where could people get help? Well, they thought they could get help from the Vatican. And in particular, it was people who got baptized who expected or hoped to get help from the Vatican. And this is one of the things that I noticed and have been interested in, because when the publicity came out about the Serie Bre, this source of 2,700 cases of people asking for help from the Vatican, first of all, it's called the Jewish file, Jewish files or series. But it was referred to as the evidence of the great help that was being provided by the Vatican for Jews who were being persecuted. And well, of course, what it turns out to be the case is that the great majority of these are baptized, and therefore, from a church point of view, should be regarded as Catholic, not Jewish. And in fact, throughout the racial laws, as Professor Ryan mentioned, this is something I've been looking at recently, the constant demands or requests of the Vatican and its agents with the fascist regime after the racial laws are instituted is to have converted Jews not considered Jews, and therefore free from the restrictions of the racial laws. What happens is Ireland begins to assume considerable importance because they're looking for a place, what to do with these Jews who are being kicked out of, or baptized Jews who are being kicked out of Italy. And what the first evidence we have of this, of the Irish involvement, comes from a letter written by the Secretary of State at the time, this man, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli. He wrote a letter on November 8th, 1938, addressed to Cardinal Schuster, the Archbishop of Milan. And in it, he writes that he was enclosing a plea he was sending to the Cardinal from, I'm quoting from his letter, a young Viennese woman of Jewish origin but Catholic resident in Milan, where his archbishopric is. He says if Schuster deemed it opportune, he should let the woman know, and here I quote from his letter, that the particular conditions in which even the Catholic Jews, kind of interesting term there, are now finding themselves following the recent government measures are the object of lively interest on the part of the Holy See, which has not failed to take the opportune steps, and that, as perhaps will already be known to your eminence, in these very days, according to information coming from the Nunciature of Ireland, the Catholics of that nation are organizing a crusade of charity in favor of converted Jewish refugees. This is November 8th of 1938, shortly after the racial laws. The Irish effort on behalf of converted Jews, to which Cardinal Pacelli is referring there, was being organized through the Irish branch of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. Is that, by the way, an organization still active that people are familiar with? I must admit I wasn't before coming across these documents. And it was brokered by the nuncio in Dublin, along with the society's president, a man named Joseph Glynn. The society, as some here I'm sure know much better than I do, was founded in 1833 in Paris as an international lay organization of Catholics dedicated, especially at the time, to bringing the poor back to Catholic practice through offering them material relief. Glynn had served as president already for over 2 decades. In fact, in 1944, the Pope himself would award Glynn a special knight, honorary knight position in the Vatican. On November 11th, so a few days later, Pacelli wrote to the rector of Rome's House of the Catechumens. The House of the Catechumens had been established back in the 16th century for the conversion of Jews and Muslims, principally Jews, and would see a kind of boom crop of baptisms of Jews in these months of the racial laws. The rector had written on behalf of a family he had converted, and Pacelli writes in response, many similar pleas have come into the Holy See, which has not failed to take opportune steps to mitigate the fate of the converted Jews. Meanwhile, I believe it opportune to inform you that, according to news coming into the Holy See, it seems that a crusade of charity is being organized among the Catholics of Ireland in favor of the refugees who are Jewish converts. That same day, Cardinal Pacelli responded to a request coming in from the Mother Superior of the Sisters of Zion in Rome with a similar message. The Holy See was doing all it could on behalf of what he referred to as converted Jews in the aftermath of the announcement of Italy's racial laws. As for the case she had recommended, Pacelli writes, I'm quoting, it might perhaps be taken into benevolent consideration by the relevant committee, which is being organized among the Catholics of Ireland in favor of the refugees who are Jewish converts. A week later, Cardinal Pacelli offered a similar response to the Bishop of Trieste, Antonio Santin. The request involved a Hungarian national, a Jewish convert to Catholicism, married to an Italian Catholic. He had been ordered out of Italy, of course, and after stating the interest that the Holy See was taking in the fate of Jews who had been converted, Pacelli added, "If then the charity is realized in favor of the converted Jewish refugees that is being organized among the Irish Catholics, the pitiful case might perhaps be brought to its attention." In a letter Pacelli wrote in late November to the rector of the House of Catechumens, in a different case, he was more specific. He said it was the Society of St. Vincent de Paul that had proposed the creation of a new committee to come to the aid of refugees who are Jewish converts to Catholicism. I thought it would be good to give some notion of the emotional tenors of the letters that are coming in that Cardinal Pacelli is reacting to, and that the bishops and archbishops of Italy were reacting to as well. And this one is a handwritten letter. I'll just put it up here if it's easier to follow. I don't know if you can read. It's, as you see, written in Italian to Sua Eminenza Cardinale Pacelli, mi rivolgo a vostra eminenza, and so on, and just the English translation there. I turn to you, Eminence, in my great desperation. I'm a German Catholic, and by March I must leave Italy because I am of Jewish descent. I don't know where to go, what to do. I'm an orphan without brothers or sisters. I live a very modest life. I give German language lessons at home. I am without means. I don't have friends. I don't have relatives. Where do I go, Eminence? What will become of me? 3 months have passed since the law in September expelling foreign Jews. 3 months I've waited for salvation and a miracle. I've entrusted my destiny to the Lord and to the Madonna. I have brought so many candles to St. Anthony. But now I am afraid. Such a great fear. I am a woman, Eminence, a woman alone in the world. You are such a great man. You have such a high position. I beg you with all my heart, help me. It is you, Eminence, who are my only hope. And as you read the so-called Jews file, you see hundreds of letters of this tenor. That the Italian bishops and archbishops to whom these immigrants were appealing were themselves moved by their plight can be illustrated by a letter sent in mid-December by this fellow, Cardinal Fossati of Turin, he's the Archbishop of Turin, to Cardinal Pacelli on behalf of 34-year-old converted Hungarian Jewish refugee who had been ordered out of the country. The young couple had come to the Archbishop's office that morning. Cardinal Fossati, in writing to Cardinal Pacelli, gives his impression. He tells Pacelli, I confess that the two individuals who are childless but who love each other very much have deeply impressed me and moved me, constantly weeping as they speak. They seem like two lost and hopeless souls because they look to the future with terror. They're disposed to go to any part of the world so that he can find work to support himself and his woman. The only problem that Fossati saw, as he explains to Cardinal Pacelli, was that the couple had not celebrated a church wedding but only been married civilly, and he didn't think the Irish Catholics would like that very much, so he suggested that if they were able to go to Ireland, they first get married in church. Well, now let me come to the nuncio. Cardinal Pacelli relied on his nuncio in Dublin for all these arrangements. That nuncio, his name is Pascal Robinson. He was quite unusual because the nuncios of essentially all the major countries in the world were Italian at the time. The Vatican itself was, and the Curia was almost entirely Italian. Of the more or less 24 cardinals of the Curia, just one was not Italian, Cardinal Tisserand, a Frenchman. And so having a kind of national as your nuncio was quite unusual. And just a brief bio sketch of Robinson. He was born in Dublin in 1870. His family emigrated to the United States. He entered the Franciscan order in 1890 and was ordained the following year. After serving in missions in the Middle East and Greece, he was appointed professor of medieval history at the Catholic University in Washington, where he served for a number of years before joining the Vatican diplomatic service, and then in 1930 being appointed nuncio for all of Ireland. The first trace of the correspondence between the Vatican and Monsignor Robinson on the Irish efforts on behalf of converted Jews comes in the form of an early December letter to Robinson from Domenico Tardini. Tardini was there were two, you might call them deputy secretaries of state under Pacelli, who would continue under the new Secretary of State after the death of Pius XI. And one would be the future pope that I referred to before, Montini, who would become Paul VI. But the other is Domenico Tardini. So this letter to Robinson from Tardini involved a case of a Jew who had fled to Italy from Germany, and then 2 years before Tardini's letter, which is December of 38, is baptized in Sicily. Enclosed, wrote Tardini, is the note regarding Hans Wolfgang Heidemann, German, a Jew by race but converted to Catholicism, who, being hit by the recent measures taken by the Italian government in defense of the race, is constrained to leave Italy by next March 12th. May it please your excellency, so he's addressing the nuncio in Dublin, may it please your excellency to signal and heartily recommend this pitiful case worthy of our benevolent consideration to Signor Glynn, President of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul of Ireland. 4 days later, on December 11th, Cardinal Pacelli himself wrote to Nuncio Robinson in Dublin, making clear that the Pope himself was following the Irish plan with great interest. Here is, as you see, I was looking for pictures of Robinson. This one's from 1932, which had a couple of rather distinguished people along with him. I hadn't realized until today was that De Valera was apparently born in New York City, but I gather there's some controversy about the details of his birth. That's for somebody else's study. Yeah, so this is the letter that Pacelli writes to Robinson December 11th, just to give you, so I'm going to show you a few of these documents just so you have a little bit of feel for what this evidence, what the documentation actually looks like in the Vatican archives. And he, responding to the activities of Sir Glenn, as he puts it, quote, in favor of the converted Jewish refugees, the Holy Father, so Pius XI, to whom I took care to report it, learned with particular satisfaction the news that everything has been arranged for 100 people of German nationality, and he heartily renews his apostolic blessing to your excellency, to the aforementioned Mr. Glynn, and to all his collaborators in this good, rewarding, and comforting work. You see there. 3 days later, Pacelli wrote the nuncio on another case and explaining that the young woman he was writing about, quote, German by nationality, a converted Jew, is forced to leave Italy following the recent measures of the Italian government in the matter of the defense of the race. And, oops. are a couple of his other letters. And then yet another letter, as you see there, to the Dublin nuncio, he wrote in December. And again, from the historian of this period, when I talk about December 38, and we'll talk about January and February 39, these are kind of crucial times in the history, of course, of the papacy and the Vatican, because Pius XI is dying. And of course, he'll be succeeded by Cardinal Pacelli, who also becomes a Chamberlain on his death. So the fact that a lot of the activity of Cardinal Pacelli in these crucial weeks has to do with his correspondence with Ireland, with the nuncio in Dublin, is kind of surprising in some ways. Well, he, on this second request, he writes, again, requesting help. So what you see is, in these months, the go-to place is Ireland for all these requests, these very dramatic pleas that they're getting from these non-Italian citizen Jews who are being kicked out and have only a couple of months to find a place to go. Otherwise, they actually are two alternatives for them if they don't find a place like Ireland to go. One is they're going to be sent back to the Third Reich. But the other, and this seems to be not very well known, that's maybe not even in Italy, but Mussolini was busy setting up concentration camps in Italy at this time initially for sending the foreign Jews or people he regarded as members of the Jewish race who were not Italian citizens. Later, those concentration camps under the so-called Republic of Salo after the German occupation and Mussolini's public government, those concentration camps would be used for all Italian Jews, would be November 30th, 1938, an order from the Italian fascist government goes out, all Jews in Italy are to be arrested, sent to concentration camps, and all their belongings seized by the government. But now we're still in early days here of the racial laws. Well, Cardinal Pacelli would bring several other cases to the attention of Nuncio Robinson over the course of the following month, that is through January 39, making similar requests. He made clear throughout that the Pope himself, Pius XI, was paying careful attention to the Irish program. The Pope, as I mentioned, now ill, weakened in the last weeks of his life, continue to follow the Irish plan with great interest. Responding to news that Glynn was running into financial difficulties in support of the plan, Pacelli wrote on January 10th, quote, "The Holy Father, to whom I have taken care to immediately report on the matter, aware of the serious difficulties, especially financial difficulties, which you point out are a major obstacle, and also moved by a sense of deep compassion for so many unfortunate people, would not be averse to studying a way to come to their aid." The Pope requested the nuncio look into whether there might be funds donated in Ireland through Peter's Pence over the past months or year that might not yet be spent, that could be redirected to support this program. On January 25th, 1939, Robinson replied with a letter to Pacelli reporting on his progress to date. Here, just to give you an idea of what the correspondence from Robinson looked like. And as you see, he was writing in Italian himself, and virtually all the correspondence with nuncios throughout the world was in Italian. He was responding to Robinson is responding to a request from Pacelli that he referred to the Irish Committee the case of Gertrude Baumgarten, a German refugee in Rome. The rector of Rome's House of the Catechumens had written in mid-November 38 on her behalf, having recently baptized her there. By the way, in 1937, there was something like 50 or 60 Jews baptized in Italy. In 1938, there were 2,700, and another couple thousand the next year. There were only about roughly 45,000 Jews in Italy at the time. We can later, if people are interested, talk more about some of the related issues there. So Robinson, in responding to this request, reported that to date he had, as a result of Pacelli's previous request, recommended 7 cases, most involving family groups, to what he simply referred to as, quote, the, quote, Irish Catholic Committee. As he explained, it was that committee that brought the cases, needed to bring the cases to the minister, the Irish Minister of Industry and Commerce, who is the government official whose approval was necessary, as he put it, to obtain the necessary authorizations for their immigration. We'll return to the government in a little while. The minister reported Monsignor Robinson, quote, showed himself well disposed to favor them insofar as possible, but believed it his duty to immediately note the impossibility of admitting doctors, given that each year 40% of the young Irish doctors are constrained to search for work abroad, given the lack of work in the fatherland. In fact, 3 of the cases that Cardinal Pacelli had recently brought to their attention involve doctors, and there seemed to be a particularly high rate of baptism of Jewish doctors in Italy in these years. In general, the Jewish population in Italy tended to be, outside of Rome at least, further north, kind of upper middle class, well-educated, with fairly high percentage of physicians. So as for the other 4 cases, the non-physician cases, the nuncio explained to Cardinal Pacelli, quote, the minister said that they could be taken into consideration separately, but that no one could obtain work in Ireland insofar as the same work could be done equally well by an Irish person. So in early February, only days before Pius XI's death, which he would die early in the morning of February 10th, 1939, and as I mentioned, that on his death, Cardinal Pacelli becomes a chamberlain, so kind of in loco pope for the period until the conclave, which of course turns out to elect him as his successor. So early February, the Cardinal Pacelli responds to Robinson with a long letter regarding the Irish Catholic Committee and its potential life-saving role given the current crisis facing converted Jews in Italy. He writes, I learned with regret that one cannot nourish any hopes, not even in a temporary stay in Ireland, for the few doctors that the Holy See has signaled to that committee of aid for converted Jewish refugees. This is all the more to be regretted, Pacelli writes, in light of the fact that these poor unfortunates, if they do not succeed in obtaining a delay, must necessarily abandon Italian territory by next March 12th without knowing where to find even temporary refuge. Given this situation, wrote Pacelli, I quote again, it would be desirable for that government, for the Irish government, not to make difficulty for their temporary residence there. By this time, the frail and ill Pope was confined to bed, and Pacelli was practically the only one, in fact, he was the only one really, other than the Pope's doctors, to get to see him while he was bedridden. And yet, what we now know is among the few things that the Pope the Pope was eager to discuss from his deathbed, essentially, was Ireland and this Irish plan. On February 8th, less than 48 hours before the Pope's death, Pacelli again reported to the Irish nuncio on the Pope's interest. I show the letter here. So you see, the Holy Father, to whom I have taken care to immediately report on the matter, in order to alleviate the suffering of these refugees in need of urgent aid, authorizes Your Excellency to pay to the said committee the bank check for £1,034 sterling, which you have recently received from His Eminence Cardinal MacRory, Archbishop of Armagh, as Peter's pence. So in other words, that earlier proposal was going ahead, of his archdiocese for the year 1938. His Holiness thus intends to help this work of human and Christian charity. With regard to the converted Jewish refugees, Your Excellency will recommend that the aforementioned committee take care of those cases, not many in fact, which have been or will be recommended by the Secretariat of State. So in his, he writes a three-page type reply, the nuncio from Dublin, to the Pope. It's now addressed 6 days after Pius XI's death. And he offers more detail on what he referred to as the Irish Catholic Committee interested in the Catholic refugees. Following Pacelli's instructions, he wrote, he had transferred to Sir Joseph Glynn, president of the society, this authorized sum of £1,034 from Cardinal McRory, the Primate of Ireland. And he attached a letter from Glynn himself, expresses his, then in Dublin, the nuncio sending a letter to now Pacelli, who's right after the death, before even the full funeral rites are completed, the death of Pius XI. And he's attaching in his letter to Pacelli the letter from Glynn. He says that that letter expresses the appreciation for the generous offer, quote, that the Holy Father of sainted and venerable memory wished to make in order to ease the suffering of the Catholic refugees in need of urgent help, unquote. The gesture, one of Pius XI's last acts, had, wrote the nuncio, made, quote, a profound impression in Ireland and will not fail to stimulate the Catholics to contribute more generously than they have to date to support this work of human and Christian charity. This turns out to be a misplaced hope. Monsignor Robinson then proceeded to give an update on what the Catholic Committee in Ireland had accomplished in response to Pacelli's requests. The committee was actively lobbying the Irish government to obtain visas on behalf of 5 of these cases, he said. He added, quote, for each visa, the committee must deposit the sum of £250 as a guarantee that the refugees in question do not subsequently become a burden on the government. Glynn, as I mentioned, he attaches this letter from Glynn, who acknowledges the receipt of the money, and however then kind of warns that the limits on his action are considerable. He says, the money available will allow of admitting only one more adult case. We are not in a position to promise immediate admission since negotiations with the government are now in progress, which we hope will result in the grant of additional visas. All right, so this is the situation as the new Pope takes on the papacy, as Cardinal Pacelli makes the transition from Secretary of State, kind of overseeing this program, to being Pope himself. Within days of his ascendancy to the papacy in early March, Pope Pacelli appointed a new Secretary of State to replace him, of course. It was Cardinal Luigi Maglione, see there. And as I mentioned, Maglione keeps the two, might again say, Deputy Secretary of State, Montini and Tardini, who had served under, so there's real continuity, had served under his predecessor, Cardinal Pacelli. And in one of his first acts, Cardinal Maglione wrote to the nuncio in Dublin to ask that the Irish committee help a man recommended by the Bishop of Trieste, who he described as a young Viennese man, Catholic, but of a mother of Jewish origin and therefore subject to the German racial laws. Cardinal Maglione, who had only been appointed Secretary of State, obviously, a day, actually in this case, a day before he writes this letter to Dublin, called on the nuncio there to, quote, urgently signal the pitiful case to the committee interested in the converted Jewish refugees. In responding, Monsignor Robinson wrote that he had, quote, immediately recommended the case to the, what he called the Committee for the Converted the converted Jewish refugees. Only 4 days after making this first appeal to Dublin, Malione wrote to the nuncio again, asking for his help with yet another case. It was similar to the first, involving an Austrian Catholic in Italy whose mother was considered of the Jewish race. The nuncio sent his reply 4 days later, reporting that he had immediately recommended the refugee to the Irish committee. Yet what we see over the next week under the new Secretary of State is an increasing impatience there in the Vatican about what was going on in Dublin and in Ireland, that they thought there was this, they had these high hopes that Dublin and Ireland was going to be a major help to them in dealing with all this huge avalanche of desperate pleas they were getting from converted Jews in the wake of the racial laws, kicking them out of the country with nowhere to go. And so Domenico Tardini writes to the nuncio at this time and sends this letter March 25th. And as you see there, he asks Robinson to tell him how much has been done to date by the committee in favor of those persons, in truth not many, who have been recommended by the Secretary of State because they find themselves in the necessity of having to leave Italian territory as soon as possible, and are anxious to know if they can rely on the help and assistance of the Irish Committee. Robinson then responds to this with a pair of reports which reflect his own frustration with what's going on in Ireland and with the help that he's getting from the lay population, but not just the lay population, the lay activists of the church and the society. In mid-April, he offered a bleak outline of the situation. He writes, "The work done by the committee in favor of the converted Jewish refugees recommended by the Holy See has had to date, as is clear, a very disappointing outcome. Indeed, the committee itself has been rather disappointed in the hopes it had when it began its charitable work. While part of its problems had resulted from difficulty in communicating with some of the people they were supposed to be helping, who could be rather transient, the major problem was different. A more fundamental problem, as he explained, was, quote, above all, in the unfavorable way in which this initiative was greeted in Ireland by various associations and by the people in general. This is the Irish nuncio writing. People in general who, full of prejudices against the Jews, not only deny the material contribution to which the committee counted on a great deal, but do not understand how one can look for employment in Ireland for foreigners while there are so many unemployed Irish, and indeed so much poverty of many Irish families." It was in his subsequent report to the Deputy Secretary of State, Tardini, a couple of weeks later, that the nuncio gave him the bad news. The Irish Committee, which Cardinal Pacelli had been so hopeful about, could be relied on no more, he said. After all the hopes that Pacelli had placed in it, it in the end had helped rather few people, very few people. The nuncio came to a conclusion that would, in essence, bring an end to the frenetic back and forth correspondence that had typified the Secretary of State office and the nunciature in Dublin over the previous weeks and months. He wrote, "The committee also let me know that it can therefore not interest itself in other people. It took this decision following the fact that the most excellent Irish bishops, in their most recent meeting of April 11th, decided unanimously not to collect funds in their dioceses for the immigration of converted Jews," unquote. Perhaps not unrelatedly, on that same day that the bishops of Ireland took their decision, Ireland's Minister for Justice, you have a picture of him, Patrick Rutledge, offered his own view of the wisdom of coming to the aid of persecuted Jews. As you see here, there has never been in this country any feeling against Jews on the scale which has shown itself in some other countries, kind of a low bar. but there are anti-Jewish groups in the country which would be only too glad to get an excuse to start an anti-Jewish campaign. And those groups could get no better slogan than that the native Irish worker was being ousted by cheap imported labor. And so, and here, just concluding remark, as the Pope and the Secretary of State geared up to deal with what would be an increasing avalanche of desperate pleas from Jews and baptized Jews for help in their desperate situation, Ireland would now play no role at all. And Ireland, which had figured so prominently in Pacelli's earlier hopes for dealing with this problem, in the end dropped from the pages of the Jews files in the Vatican Secretary of State archives. So after April or so, 1939, there'll be only a very rare passing mention of Ireland at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for a very stimulating, thought-provoking presentation, bringing up issues, I think, that are very current for us today and seem all too familiar. I assume that there will be lots of questions. People who want to comment, ask questions, clarification. So there's time for Q&A, there's time for discussion for the next 20-25 minutes. And Oisin, our student ambassador, is there at the back with a roving mic. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will point you, and Oisin will come to you with the roving mic. So it's open to the floor.
Were any of the baptized Jews any ex-members of the fascist party in Italy?
Well, until 1938, with the racial laws that turned against the Jews in Italy, roughly the same proportion of Jews in Italy as Catholics in Italy were members of the fascist party. I don't think whether they were baptized or not probably, would be a major factor. There really wasn't a differentiation. I mean, one of the reasons the Jews were so shocked in Italy by the racial laws is that, you wouldn't be shocked by what Hitler did. His Nazi philosophy, if we call it that, was based on anti-Semitism from the beginning. But Mussolini, first of all, when he first came to power, his main confidant was his lover, who was a Jewish woman from Venice, Margherita Sarfatti. And then during the fascist regime, he had a Jewish minister of finance in his government. The relatively long-time mayors of Trieste and Ferrara were Jewish, and so on. So this really came as a shock. So as a result, related to that is the fact that it wasn't at all uncommon for an Italian Jew to be a member of the fascist party.
Thank you very much, Professor. And a question prompted by your last slide, and you quoted from Professor Dermot Keogh, and I know his area of expertise was the relationship between Ireland and the Holy See at the time of World War II. And I remember in the controversy after the publication of John Cornwall's text, Hitler's book, he said that the Irish ambassador to the Holy See, Pope Pius XII confided to the Irish ambassador that were the Vatican to fall to the Axis powers, that he would, of course, flee to Ireland. Now, I wonder if that's a view that might have been informed by his dealings with, let's say, the Society of St. Vincent de Paul and the Nuncio before the outbreak of the war, or is there any evidence from your research of that he held that opinion, and did he subsequently learn of the ultimate failure of the plan to send refugees to Ireland?
Did Pius
Did Pius XII learn subsequently of the failure of the plan to send refugees to Ireland?
Well, yeah, I mean, Pius XII, of course, is being briefed regularly by his Secretary of State or his two deputies about exactly the kind of correspondence from the nuncio that I was referring to. So he was certainly fully aware of that, and I'm sure very disappointed by it, given the hopes he'd placed in the Irish plan. I find it difficult to believe that the Pope would have said he planned to go to Ireland if the Germans ended up winning the war, because he made quite a big stand. There were those who were calling on him to flee, even with the German occupation of Rome, and he always refused and said no, he would never leave, that others might, but the Pope's place was in Rome as the Bishop of Rome, and they would have to take him out on his death, because he would stay there to the very end. There have been long traditions over the beginning of the 19th century when about popes fleeing. When Rome is conquered in 1870 by the Italian army, and the Pope excommunicates the king and the Prime Minister of Italy, and refuses, says no Catholic should recognize the validity of the Italian government. There were certainly many who were counseling him to leave Italy and Rome altogether, and so there's kind of a long history of this question of would the Pope leave Rome, which goes back probably even further. But I think Pope Pacelli was quite adamant about he would never leave Rome.
In terms of the letters, as you read out, it would say things such as German national of Jewish race or Hungarian national of Jewish race. Did you find in your research that when discussing the baptized Jews, there was particular emphasis on one or the other when it came to the refugee resettlement program?
I mean, one versus the other in terms of nation, or?
Nation versus race.
Oh. Well, one of the things I've been interested in is the question of the adoption. To what extent did the church adopt a racial kind of vocabulary? So certainly from as we know well, from a Catholic theological point of view, one should not distinguish about race. I mean, and certainly in terms of if one is Catholic, one's Catholic and should be accorded all the rights, both R-I-G-H-T and I guess R-I-T-E-S, that a Catholic should have. But I didn't see any sign of differentiation made in the Vatican of whether someone was from Germany or France or Austria and so forth. They were, I think, all treated the same. I mean, one thing we see in the Jews file, I've had a bit of a disagreement. Hubert Wolff, who I showed in that slide before, that first morning with his group at the Vatican Archives, has made a recent point that looking at the Jews file, it made no difference to the Vatican, to the Secretary of State, whether a request came from a baptized Jew or a still Jewish Jew. They did the same thing in helping them, in offering help. And although there's something behind that, it's actually very misleading, partly because there was very little in most of these circumstances the Vatican actually could do if someone was Jewish. And for instance, one of the, I didn't talk about this here, but what takes the place of Ireland? Well, actually Brazil takes the place of Ireland right after this, because in honor of the new Pope, Pope Pacelli, the president of Brazil offers 3,000 visas to converted Jews that had to have been baptized to come. And this was a lifeline would be a lifeline for many. But if someone who is still Jewish wrote begging, I need, get out of Europe, out of Italy, there was nothing they could do, even if they had wanted to do something. Whereas if they had converted and been baptized before a certain date, because Brazil also didn't want Jews who had just been baptized since the racial laws came in, then they could actually help them. So this was kind of another issue. In the Jews file, 80% of the individuals asking for help were baptized, and about 20% were not baptized. And of course, part of that reason for that is who would turn to the Vatican for help? I mean, if you were Jewish, it wasn't obvious that you would look to the Vatican for help, whereas, of course, if you were baptized, then especially in the Italian context, it might be the first place you'd look for help.
This may stray too far into the Irish politics side of it than the Vatican politics side of it. Would, from what you've found, you be able to speculate as to whether the failure of the Irish scheme is more because of resistance from the Irish government and, say, not making an offer equivalent to the Brazilian one you've just mentioned, or the failure of the Irish hierarchy and presumably congregations as well to put their hands in their pockets and find the money to pay for it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so as you intimate, I'm not an expert on the Italian politics of the time, but my impression from the correspondence is that while the government was not sympathetic and was not very forthcoming certainly about visas, you heard, from their point of view. And it's interesting to me, they talk about the attitudes toward Jews. They were only talking about baptized individuals, so, but still they were looking at them as Jews. And so, it really did seem to be that meeting of the bishops where they basically put an end to it, thinking apparently that it would create too much difficulties with their parishioners and too much ill will. So, why go out on a limb for foreign baptized Jews, basically.
Other questions, comments? Yes, Stephen.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm going to ask a question that historians probably don't want to have raised, but if you could take a crack at it. What is your assessment of the debate over the silence of Pius XII? I mean, we're seeing here someone who does care, seems constrained by a lot of contingencies. Could you say a few words about that for us?
Yes, of course, that's sort of the big question and a very controversial one. Well, so I think on the one hand, the claim that the Pope didn't speak out because it would lead to more Jews get Hitler angrier at the Jews. I mean, that seems kind of ridiculous on its face to me. I mean, Hitler wanted to wipe out all the Jews from Europe, and would have if he hadn't been defeated before he finished the task. But a couple of things. One is, in some of these contexts, he was concerned about converted Jews. And often the attempt was made to protect them, and in some circumstances, even the Germans would, certainly in Italy, allow for converted Jews to have more possibility of survival, put it that way. I think, so on the one hand, as we can see from these cases, the Pacelli was personally moved, felt sympathy. You could have tears in his eyes sometimes when he's talking about what was going on. But he, from my own interpretation, from spending years in these archives, is he saw his primary job as protecting the institutional church in a extremely perilous time. First of all, I think you also have to look at when in the war. You can't, so that in the first years of the war, there was good reason to believe Hitler was going to win the war. I mean, he was supposed to be this impregnable, Maginot Line that was protecting France and so on. The Germans just go right through it within days, practically or weeks. take over much of Europe and North Africa and so on. So early on, he's worried about not antagonizing Hitler. Not that, the notion of Hitler's Pope, the John Cornwell title, is certainly totally inappropriate. He was not Hitler's Pope, and he certainly had absolutely no love for Hitler and saw Nazism as a antagonist of the church. But he was worried about protecting the church, what would happen in a Europe under rule by the Nazis together with their pal, Mussolini. Then later in the war, when it was pretty clear the Allies were likely to win the war, the situation was a little bit different. And some of the documents I found suggest that he was worried about, and maybe it's his World War I experience that led to this, that if he now spoke out against the Germans, he would be held responsible by German Catholics for their defeat in the war. Kind of stab in the back idea. And the other thing I think, kind of an uncomfortable truth is, who was it who was killing all the Jews? It was not people who thought they were pagans, people who thought they were Christians, obviously Protestants, not just Catholics. And so the Pope was very worried about, maybe he had the Reformation in mind, I don't know, about the Protestant church had already split over its attitude toward the Nazis in Germany. And I think he was also worried about the Catholics in Germany from that point of view. So that's my interpretation. It wasn't, so I don't think some people will say, oh, he was anti-Semite or the church was anti-Semitic and that's why he didn't speak out. I don't think that's a major factor here. There was a generic anti-Semitism in the church, but there was a generic anti-Semitism much more generally in the Western world at the time. So that's, I guess, in brief, would be my reading of the situation.
This is slightly at a tangent, but from your looking in the Vatican archives, did you have any evidence of any of the Vatican buildings being used to shelter baptized Jews?
So, there's been a lot of discussion of the protection of Jews by the Vatican and during the war in Rome in particular. Very few Jews, whether baptized or not, were given refuge in the Vatican, and the Pope basically clearly opposed it. And the few who were there were basically snuck in. And that said, of course, Catholic religious institutions in Rome protected many hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews, although not all the religious institutions were willing to take Jews in, and some only if they were baptized. So it's kind of a complicated situation, but and that was part of a much larger pattern where, because the Jews were not demographically the main group being protected in the convents and monasteries and so on in Rome, it was various demobilized Italian soldiers who otherwise were facing forced labor in Germany and anti-fascists and so on, who were being protected along with both baptized and not baptized Jews.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. A general question of context. You mentioned earlier in your talk that anti-Semitism was ambient in Europe at the time. I'm just wondering, when you compare the fascists in Italy to the Nazis in Germany, given that there is anti-Semitism in Italy too, the racialization of Italian fascism to the creation of the racial laws, which are anti-Semitic, was that, in your view, inherent in Italian fascism, or is it some sort of a Nazi influence on Italy, particularly as you were saying in those early years of the war when when Germany, this is the rising star. I know the laws come in much earlier than that, but was it the rising tide of Nazism that influenced Mussolini and the fascists to be explicitly anti-Semitic with the racialist laws, or was it something already there in fascism?
Yeah, no, I think it was not something inherent in Italian fascism, that it had to do with, there was some, because of the timing, remember I mentioned that Hitler has this triumphal visit to Rome and Naples and Florence with Mussolini in May of 1938, and then it's in July, in 38, so a couple months later, that he announces the new racial policy. So there were some that said, during that visit, Hitler had a word, say, get with the program and you've got to do something. But there's absolutely no evidence that Hitler actually brought this up with him then. And it seems to be the case that for various reasons, Mussolini was trying to, you might say, play up to Hitler or show he was just as tough as Hitler, and this could be one way of doing it. So I'd say that's, there's one Italian historian wrote a book called, Mussolini racist, and makes the case that Mussolini was always anti-Semite and so on, so there's no big surprise. But I think, as I mentioned, his longtime lover was Jewish. His government members were Jewish and so forth. I think, again, it wouldn't be hard to pick out. He was someone who was very outspoken and provocative, so you could easily find quotes early on where he says anti-Semitic kinds of things, but I really don't think this could explain the racial laws.
So at the end of this part of this evening's proceedings, I'd like to offer a vote of thanks. Events like this don't just organise themselves. So I would like to express my thanks to the President's Office here at St. Patrick's Pontifical University, to Caroline Tennyson, to Tracy Flinter, to the marketing team, to Paul Hurley, and especially to Keane Roach, who has been extremely helpful over the last few days. To our student ambassadors this evening, to Louise and to Colette and to Oisin, who has been going around with the roving mic. Thank you so much for being here and for your assistance this evening. Gerard Doyle is here, and I'd like to, Gerard has been filming our proceedings tonight, so hopefully that this lecture will appear on the college's YouTube channel over the coming weeks. So to Ger and his team at Kairos, thank you so much. Thank you also in anticipation to the catering department and who have prepared the reception for us this evening, which is at the back of the room. So please, if you do have time, do stay around to meet old friends, to make new friends, and to have a chance to chat to David more informally. And if you have any questions that you didn't want to bring up or didn't want to bring up in public, you can certainly chat to David after this evening's talk. And finally then, to David himself, thank you so much for being here amongst us. Your talk has raised so many questions, has been so thought-provoking, and as I said, it's themes and it's the anxieties that were expressed in your talk tonight, anxieties coming from various sectors are unfortunately all too common and all too familiar to us today. So whether it be the 1930s or the 1940s or 2025, there are themes tonight that are unfortunately all too common. Thank you so much for a very thought-provoking, stimulating lecture, which will have us all thinking for some time to come. And we do look forward to reading more in your forthcoming book next year. David, thank you so much.